And we will start this third session by giving the floor to Mr. Éric David, Director of the Economical Service, the French representation of the OECD. He'll talk about the Paris Compact for the people on the planet. Thank you very much. I'll talk about fundings and money, and I will start with some observations. The first observation is to tell you that historically, public aid to development has never been so high. This year, it's $200 billion. However, these are low amounts in comparison with the needs. When we try to assess the needs, it's never easy. It's about $2,000 or $3,000 billion per year to reach the Sustainable Development Goals to fight poverty, and about the same amount would be necessary, $2,000 to $3,000 billion, for the climate transition in developing countries. And we regularly talk about this, but the cost of rebuilding Ukraine should be added to this. And based on the most conservative studies, it should be about the same amount as well. In other words, in order to fill the gap between public development aid and the needs for fundings, public aid to development should be multiplied by 20 or 30, which is impossible due to budget constraints. A second observation is about non-state actors. If the money coming from the north is not enough through public funds, it could also come from non-state actors. Two types: either private market flows, and I'll come back to this because this is probably where there is the largest potential in terms of funding flows, or private non-market fundings, and that's called philanthropy. And I would like to tell you that according to the OECD data, if we added all the actions taken by philanthropies in developing countries, if philanthropy were a country, it would be the equivalent of the public aid to development of the UK or France. A third observation: if this money does not come from the north, private or public, it could also come from the global south. There is a resource that is underused in developing countries, that is taxes. The average taxation rate in the sub-Saharan African countries is 16% of the GDP. In France, we often talk about tax rates that are too high, but when they're too low, it's also a problem to develop infrastructure. And in sub-Saharan countries, it's clearly not enough. Look at the average tax rate out of the GDP in Nigeria. It's at 5.5%. DRC is at about 7%, and Guinea Equatorial is at 7%. As well. If you compare it to developed countries, the tax rate in Latin America is higher. It's at 22% of GDP and more than 30% in the OECD countries. Three observations then, and in the face of those observations, we had to try and find solutions. And those topics that were discussed in June during the conference in Paris led to the signing of the Paris Covenant for people on the planet. Two objectives. No country should have to choose between fighting poverty and preserving the planet. So out of the SDGs for poverty and the ones for the climate, there should be no choice. It doesn't make sense to build a coal plant in sub-Saharan countries because the area is harder to live in, and on the opposite case, there's no point in fighting climate change if you do nothing to fight poverty. And there are actually interactions between the two that are quite significant. Second thing, each country adopts their own strategy in the transition, taking into account their needs and constraints. This is decentralized for the Paris Covenant. Thirdly, the need for a public fund shock to help vulnerable economies to get the population out of poverty. That's the figures I gave earlier, but I'll come back to that in the actions part. Fourth target of the Paris Covenant for the people on the planet is to get further leverage in order to multiply private fundings on those challenges, and that's where there is a channel that needs to be created so that the current private market flows that are usually north to north flows, part of this could be diverted to the south with positive flows, because with the increase of interest rates, we're in a situation where private flows are almost higher in terms of reimbursement than when they're being received. In the face of this, what actions could be taken? A first action works well in English, do not harm. So if you're not doing good, at least try not to harm. That relates to fossil fuels exit program. And the first thing to do in this regard is to use the dirtiest energies and cut public fundings in these. And those public fundings for fossil fuels have three types. Either it's public aid to development, either it's exportation, or national taxes. National taxes are the responsibility of developing countries, but the other two are the responsibility of developed countries. Commitments have been made. The agreements around the end of funding for fossil fuels were signed by 30 countries, not all of the OECD countries, but 30 of them. Some are missing. Regarding exportation funding, it's not about all the fossil fuels, but part of coal only. And of course, overall, we are observing a decrease of those fundings, but there are still some left. A second action is respecting or holding the promises made on climate funding. Those promises date back from Copenhagen, 2009, and today the figures will be announced. The Secretary General of OECD announced that the 100 billion euros limit has been reached, with a large part of concession public fundings. I know there are debates on the figures. I will dwell for some time on the fact that a good APD does not have to be a high volume. A good public aid to development is an efficient one. Loans can be more efficient than donations. If there is a good leverage, it's best to have 100 loan with an efficiency of 10 rather than a donation of 10 efficient to 1. If you give money to save the mangrove, it makes sense. But if it's to build a sanitation station, it's not obvious that it's very relevant financially. I can answer questions about this, if any. We have, in 2022, because there's a slight delay, this commitment was met, the target of 100 billion for climate funding. Second action would be dynamic to mobilize funds in favor of the most vulnerable. Once again, this is IMF money this time. It was enshrined in August 2021, and this must have a positive impact in the poorest countries, those drawing rights. This comes from an instrument created in 2022 called the Fiduciary Fund for Resilience and Sustainability. It's now operational. It should amount to $29 billion by 2025. A third action required is to reform the multilateral development banks, that's the World Bank. The narrative has been modernized in support of reforms of other multilateral funding institutions. This was announced in the G20 summit in Delhi with targets that are higher and a narrative that has been significantly modernized regarding an alliance between the fight against poverty and the fight against climate change. A fourth element is around the debt. How to resolve the indebtedness of the most vulnerable and include climate action. And one of the questions is how to include in those loans a climate component. In other words, how to make sure that we can suspend a debt in case of a major climate incident. If it's Pakistan with huge storms, how to include a collective clause to suspend the debt in those loans. This is starting to be implemented. It's not the case for all instruments. It's the case in loans from the French Treasury. It's done as well by the AFD. And the point is to have this in the different loans in the long run. A fifth element is the work on innovative fundings. The title is nice, but nobody should think that there's magical money. That does not exist. Innovative fundings means implementing a form of tax to derive part of the money from benefits towards development, the fight against climate change, the fight against climate change and development. But let's be cautious. There's an issue of scale. Let me give you an example. If we were to tax each oil barrel with $1 tax, you would get more or less 30 to 50 billion additional revenue. That's good. I'm not saying it's not good. That's about the equivalent of American public development aid. But that's very far from the required scale. It's not a game changer. It can be a component of the solution. Some are talking about super profits. This is being discussed at the OECD as part of tax agreements. There's also the question of taxation of maritime transportation of certain assets that consume or emit a lot of CO2. But once again, let's be cautious. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that it's not the right scale in order to fully meet those needs. A sixth element is around governance. Certain things have already been done, for example, validating a third African representative at the board of the IMF. There are certain questions around shares. There are also discussions around the representation at the G20 with a new permanent member, the African Union, but we need everybody around the table to discuss those topics. And finally, and if you allow me, I'll take a few minutes on this last element, that is the leverage to reduce risks in the financial sector that would like to intervene in developing countries. And this is probably where the highest resources are available. And I'm going to try and be as direct as possible. We have rules, financial rules, that are great in terms of stability, and these rules have allowed to get back to an acceptable financial balance after the 2008 crisis. The point is not to undo those rules. However, without undoing those rules, they can probably adapt it to development needs. Those rules were designed to stop the 2008 crisis, and they mainly focus on developed countries. However, they had an effect that was not perceived when the interest rates were low. Back then, there were significant private flows coming from developed countries going towards developing countries. That was the case over the past decade, up until 2021. But when the interest rates are going up, the developing countries are excluded and penalized. Of course, we need to question certain things. The point is not to undo what was done in Basel III, but for certain aspects, they might not be as relevant anymore as it might seem. Let me give you an example. In a standard model, following the Basel III rules, an infrastructure project requires 25% capital in the OECD and 49% in a country that is not part of the OECD. Why not? But I'm bothered by the fact that this does not relate to the risk. The fact that you need to provision a certain amount in proportion with the risk, it makes sense. But if you do it based on a geographical criteria, meaning being an OECD country or not, that is debatable. And in this topic, there is a lot of questions. This is why it's necessary to work with rating agencies, whether they're public or private. At the OECD, there is a rating agency, and that's how we price export tariffs. This model should be questioned. It would be interesting to see why certain African countries have such a low rate, why almost all sub-Saharan countries have such a low rate, and see if we could fine-tune this in order to differentiate between those who made reforms and those who didn't. This would be a way to redistribute certain flows and to integrate more upstream the African continent and the sub-Saharan region into global flows, which are probably the only ones who can meet those needs in terms of volumes. I can go further on this. I'm going to stop, but I'm being told that I'm out of time.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, il y a une question qui m'a interpellée particulièrement.
Thank you very much. I had a question that was particularly interesting. Does the OECD have an idea of the use of this money that is being distributed, if there is a good use of those funds? What is your assessment on what the use is being made of those funds? There are measurements, of course. There's a whole part of the OECD working on development. When it comes to development, the size of the OECD Secretariat is almost 300 people dedicated to this topic. And you should also add the people in the member states. And out of these people, there's a large part of statistics experts. So this is quite a powerful tool because each member state of the OECD notifies the OECD of all their development projects. So France sends all the projects every year with AFD, with Bercy, Quai d'Orsay, and all the other institutions do the same. And as a French representative, I can check what Sweden did in 2022, for example. Then the statistics experts at OECD assess the efficiency of the aid. So line by line, we measure this. Everything can always be improved, of course, but this is being measured, and in comparison with what was done in the 90s, for example, It's much more scientific than what used to be done 20 or 25 years ago. And now, at national level, there are entities dedicated to assessing aid who perform much better than 25 years ago. So it's a positive response for me, although it can always be improved, of course. Thank you. We also have a question. Could you come back to the cases where loans are more interesting than donations, or at least, I guess, more efficient? And we could also talk about crowdfunding. Yes, I can add other examples. Guarantees can be more efficient. Capital shares can be more efficient. So there is a whole series of financial instruments available, and all these options available at national level in the private sector are also usable for development. It's not only donation. Let me take an example. I'll get back to that example of a sanitation plant. Let's imagine that it costs 300 million, a big station for a large city in a given developing country. If you don't have those 300 million euros available because you use them for something that is not profitable, for example, saving the mangrove, saving the corals, you will never get a mixed intervention. So you use that fully public money to do this, so you consume that money to do this, and you have less money. Let's imagine that you don't have the 300 millions and it's only done by donation. If you're still missing 200 millions, you can either not build the plant or make it smaller. If you do it with a loan, from a budget perspective, it will be cheaper. That doesn't mean that the loan doesn't cost anything or is not profitable. This is not like a mortgage. There are concessions, and this is still way under the market. If it's a small company, you can get 50% donations with very lengthy loans, with grace periods that are very lengthy and very low interest rates. So in this case, you will probably have enough cash to get the 300 million and probably 600 or 700 million. And instead of having 0 stations with donations, you might get 2 or 3. And ultimately, that is what matters. So the right answer is to use the whole range of instruments available in order to increase efficiency and be more efficient. And we could go even further and sometimes not do loans, but guarantees. The North doesn't pay anything, you just have to guarantee the loan, and that's enough to make a project profitable, which can make it a reality. I'll ask a question that relates to this. Are there advice given to find the best funding method?
Yes, there are several things. There is what the developing country wants. So imagine you're the local government and the local town or region that's going to benefit from the water plant, and also local finance. They're going to receive this grant, but they might be interested in guarantees as well, or shares. And it's a dialogue that we should have with the developing countries, and it's a multilateral and bilateral discussion that should take place. And only through this can we have a demultiplication of what we couldn't have with a loan, because it's 1 euro that we have to the left and we put it to the right, but at the end of the day it's only ever just 1 euro. Another question, I think many people are creating a link between your presentation and others on dependence of Africa towards flows that don't come from Africa and come from the north. So the private funding of development can allow for raising more funds, but doesn't this contribute to the dependence of the south towards the north? This is a difficult question. Yes, but it's a topic that we shouldn't hesitate to address. What is dependency? The fact that a company is partially owned by private capital? Is it because they depend on them, or is it because they're open-minded? I'm going to turn the question around. According to the person asking the question, what is better for the worker in Belfort, to the east of France? Is it not having a job anymore, not having a production site anymore, or their production site being bought over by foreign capital? Same for Africa. Is it better to have an electric system that is funded by loans and grants, and part of it is owned by foreign companies, more developed ones? Or is it to try to have everything national? Historical experience has proven that the more open the country, the more open to foreign capital, the more the country is open to foreign trade, the more it develops. And the more it is self-sufficient, the least it is developed. Over the last 3 centuries, we've had many such examples. So I'm tempted to say it's not being dependent, it's an interaction, it's an openness, it's an interdependency, an integration in international flows. And the more integrated you are, the richer you get. And then it's for you to know where you put your boundaries and where difficulties start. But I don't think we should be afraid of the outside. To the contrary. There are many questions on this topic, indeed, but they are long questions, so it's difficult.
Alors, je vais en prendre une que j'ai pas pré-relue. Connaît-on le ratio qui exprime pour le total des
Do we know the ratio for the overall ODA funding, the part used by state agents? You've already answered that question. Why don't you take into account the democracy aspect in the combination for the fight against poverty and climate change within the framework of the Paris agenda? That's a good question. It's an important topic that we've discussed at length with an answer which is not easy at all. First of all, we need to define what democratic criteria would be. Not easy, first of all. And second thing, greenhouse gases have no borders. And they don't care about democracy either. The world is not black and white. What do we do in the face of a country that has democratic elements, but it's not perfect? Do we stop? If we stop, we don't help them. And if we don't help them, we are setting obstacles in their path towards democracy, and it's counterproductive. So there's a balance to strike, and it's also, you can find it in the assessment that I talked about in the first question, that we have to find between taking elements, encouraging them on the way towards greening their country and democracy, and not stop at the first problems, because it's going to be shortcomings, and we know that when it comes to climate change, the fight against climate change, it would be a disaster. Thank you very much.
Alors, merci.